In this lesson, we're going to add some depth to our scene by changing the position and scale of our layers. Okay, so we've split all of our layers up here with the masks that we created, and really quickly I want to go through and kind of rename these so they don't all have that same outdoor scene.psd name. So right here in my timeline, I'm just going to right click the layer I want to rename, go here to rename, and then I'm just going to type in water for this layer. And then our next layer is going to be the hills layer, so we could type in close hills. And then we have the hills with cabin layer. And then we have our further away mountains, so far mountains. And then the last layer is our sky. Okay, so that's just going to make it a little bit easier to tell what we're changing on our timeline. Okay, so now I want to go ahead and kind of change the positions of some of these layers to give me a little bit more depth, so when we start adding some camera movement, we can really see a shift. So I'm going to first of all turn the 3D switch on for all of my layers, just so that they can be moved in 3D space. And now we'll start with the water, and actually the position for the water I'm going to leave the same, because if I bring up the position for that, that's just at a 0 in Z space. So that's kind of just this base point, and I'm just going to leave that as it is. So we'll start off with the close hills layer as far as actually moving that one in Z space. So we'll bring up the position for that. I'm just selecting my layer and hitting the P key to look at that value. And I'm going to just move this backwards in space, which is going to give me a positive number since it's going to be moving away from my camera. I'm going to move that to about 200 right there in Z space. And then I want to scale it up a little bit as well to kind of make it fill this area a little bit better. So with that close hills layer selected, I'm just going to grab the edge of it and hold shift to constrain it proportionally. And then I want to see how big I'm actually scaling this up. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that layer and hit the S key to bring up my scale. And I'm actually going to scale this up pretty large because I want to be able to use this in a way later where we're covering up any edges that we would maybe get from overlap. So we can go back and adjust that a little bit more if we need to, but for now I'm going to leave this as a pretty large scale layer. Okay, let's move on to our hills and cabin layer. I'm going to bring up the position for that one. And I'm just going to move this one forward in space as well. And I'm actually going to double the position that I added to the Z space of my close hills layer. So I'm just going to put that one at about 400. So we can kind of drag that back there to 400. And then we'll scale this one up also. So I'm going to select the layer, hit the S key, and start dragging the scale up. And this one's going to get pretty large as well. Just maybe a little bit bigger than the close hills layer that we had. So I'm going to move that up, and for now you may not be able to see that cabin, but that's okay. Whenever we move our next layer, it should pop back in. Okay, so let's start there with our far mountains. I'm going to grab the position for that. We can push that one backwards. And again, we want to add another 200 pixels to the position of this one, so about 600. So I'm just dragging that to that value there. And you could also type that in if you already knew what you wanted to change that to. And then I'm going to scale this one up as well. So we'll select our layer, hit the S key, and then just drag that scale up. Now this one I'm not going to make quite as large in scale as I did the other ones. Maybe just about the same, something right around there. And now let's do it for our sky. So we'll add another 200 pixels in position to our sky. So we'll select the sky, hit the P key to bring that up, and then we'll just drag that backwards there. And another 200 pixels from our far mountains would be 800. So we'll drag that all the way up there. And then we want to scale this one up as well. So we'll hit the S key to bring that up. And then I'm just going to scale it up enough to fill that area. Okay, so right now it may look a little bit different than it did in the beginning, but once we get that camera animating in the background, it's really going to make a difference for what we see and the way that these layers are interacting. And we may want to add a little bit of a feather to the masks that we created, just so that we can kind of have a little bit of a softer edge here. You notice that as I move this layer around, it feels very rigid compared to the edge that we see there along this ridge line right there. So I'm going to solo this layer right here just by clicking this switch, and then we'll go into the mask options for that layer. And this is going to be our second mask that I'm looking at here. I'm just going to drag the feather up just a little bit right around there, just to make that edge not quite so harsh. And then we can also do that there along the bottom for the mask feather right there, and just kind of feather that into the water a little bit along that edge. Let's go ahead and do this for the rest of our layers as well. So we'll do this for the water. Now the water one I don't want to be feathered out too much, because I still want to be able to see a pretty good edge between the ground and that water, so that we're really getting the depth to look realistic. So I wouldn't really drag this one out too far, just something right in there, about 20 pixels. And then now let's go ahead and do that for our hills cabin layer. And this one is definitely going to need some feathering. I want to be careful not to feather too much so that the top of that cabin isn't lost, so I may need to readjust my mask here in a moment. But I'm just going to drop that down to see my mask right along that edge. And this bottom edge right here is just pretty good there, right around 12 pixels of feather. Now this top one we want to pay special attention to, that we're not cutting off too much of the top of that cabin, and if I feel like I am, I can certainly go in there with my selection tool and just move those points individually, making sure that none of that is going to be cut off. Okay, that looks pretty good. It's better to have a little bit too much than too little. So we can go back in and make that a harsher edge later on if we need to. Okay, let's do it for the far mountains layer. And this one I can add some feather along this top mask here. I really don't need to do much for the bottom, since our other layer overlaps that so much. So we really can just start with that mask 4 and turn the feather up there in the sky. Now I'm going to do it right to where I start to see the edge of my hill looking like it's being made transparent just a little bit there. And that's really okay, because this one's going to be so far away, it's all going to blend together, and you won't really be able to tell that that's actually getting cut off at all. So that's totally fine just as it is. Now let's go ahead and do this for our sky layer as well. Now, once I have this sky layer soloed, I'm noticing that the edge of the mask, because we're using a couple different masks to achieve what we have here, I'm not really going to need to draw it in the way that I am showing the edge of my sky. So if I come in here and just kind of look at the edges, because this one's going to be all the way in the back, I don't really need to feather the edge of that sky. So we can leave this one as it is. So I'm just going to unsolo that sky layer and kind of take a look at what we have up here with the rest of the feathering that we've created. Now the rest of these layers look pretty good. Right along here it's getting a little bit hazy, so maybe we go back into the see which layer is causing that. It looks like that's probably the hills and cabin layer, so I can just kind of zoom back in there and adjust this mask a little bit. We don't want to move the whole mask, we just want to move the points. So we'll grab that point there and just kind of move it closer into the actual edge, so that we're not seeing that mountain and kind of that haze that we're getting along there. So I can just kind of pull this down right along there. And you can go in and spend as much time as you want really perfecting the mask at this point. But that looks pretty good for now. If we need to, we can go back and adjust that more later. Okay, one last thing that I want to do is to add a solid behind all of my layers that's not going to be a 3D layer, that's just going to give me a little bit of insurance that if some of my layers don't overlap perfectly, that's going to be there to kind of cover that up. And I'm going to just make it the same color as my sky up here so that if the shift were to happen where some of these layers weren't overlapping perfectly, it would be most apparent in the area where we see this lightest color. So that's how we would choose what color to make that solid. So we'll go up here to Layer, New, Solid, and just use the eyedropper tool to kind of pick this bluish, really light blue color. And then I'm just going to put that at the back of all of my layers. And we'll just leave that down there. I can lock that. I'm not going to mess with it. It's just going to sit there as kind of just a place that is going to help me if I get any kind of layers that aren't overlapping each other perfectly. So in this lesson, we learned that by changing the positions of our layers in Z-space, we can add some depth to our scene. And by changing our scale, we can fill in any gaps that we might be getting in between the layers.